data is really critical at both citizen level and at the governance level. In terms of the data that informs the programmatic policy action, government planning and government programs, but also government spending. And then data at the level of citizens that enables social accountability, but also citizen engagement in the political process of governance. One of the things we want to show is that, yes, there is a dearth of data. That's no doubt. But what are we doing with what we have? Let's start from there and then push for new data. Because the fast and easy excuse, when I go to many meetings, as I was talking to some this morning, I said, the thing that I hear, especially when donors are sitting around the room, capacity development. We need money for capacity, and yes, we need money for data. But nobody talks about what we are doing with the data that we have. And all of this is publicly available from Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. So it's not a mystery that we can use what we have. So what we're basically trying to figure out is, given the data that we have, can we look at the footprint and the results of development interventions in this country? Because the government has been doing a lot of development. Donors are killing themselves in places like northern Kenya, risking everything. With that, mobilizing data effectively is actually looking at the various places where data resides. Of course, government is one of those institutions that actually collects and keeps a lot of that data. Oftentimes, they have all of these anxieties and doubts about how much and how far they can share the data. Therefore, sometimes the data sits there without the data being linked to the policies and decision makers that need it. And sometimes it's not accessible to the public that needs that data for social accountability. And sometimes it's not available to the academia that then should ask questions of implementation, success or failure of existing policies and government initiatives. In Mandera, for instance, many years of what we've done in this country, if you live in Mandera, you're twice more likely to be illiterate, okay, than if you live in Nyamira. Look at that outcome, for instance. If you're in Mandera, you're more likely to die, 3 times more likely to die before your first 5 years of life. So look at this. These things are insane. This is the 21st century. Why are these life chances for kids so differentially inequitable? And then what are we doing with these kinds of things? Because this is the aggregate outcome of all the policies and decisions that we've taken for the last 50 years. This is the outcome. If you look at it from the human development indicators, outcome, it is the health, it's the education, it is the income. If you live in Mandera, you're 10 times less likely to enroll in secondary school. And now you're told that this is a knowledge economy. So honestly, how can Mandera compete? So the question of mobilizing data is an open one, and I think there's a lot of conversation about open government. But the question really it still goes back to the core question: data for who and for what. So just saying we're going to have open data is creating an object for which there's no demand. The question is, if there's an online portal, what do I do with that portal? When I go in there, when I download a graphic, when I download an Excel spreadsheet, what do I do with it? What does it tell me? And where can I take that conversation, and who will be willing to listen to me?
Okay, so what are the best ways forward in terms of dealing with resource distribution, given the inequalities that we have in Kenya today and the existing Commission on Revenue Allocation formula? I think that, of course, the formula has a period during which it's revised, and we follow the legal framework for that. But as we know, the question of the CRA formula is really just one focal point for thinking about distribution of resources. There are many other ongoing processes of resource distribution, both at the national level and the county level.
When we talk about distribution of resources, we often want to start talking about money, and we want data, and of course we're here talking about data today, and data is very critical, but we actually don't start the conversation about how to redistribute resources or distribute resources with data. We start the conversation with principles. By what principles do certain people have certain rights or certain claims to funds? That's how we have to start. And then, principles, of course, are not enough. We can say need, but then somebody says they need and another person says they need. So how do we then adjudicate those different claims? Or somebody says I need more, and somebody says yes, but I can use the money better, bringing in ideas of ability or capacity or other principles, and then we have to adjudicate those claims. And to adjudicate those claims, we need to think about the principles and how we feel about them, and then we also need to bring data to bear. So we need to bring the two things together. These are principles that emerge from philosophy, from theories of justice, that emerge from practice of distributing resources around the world, and we've just tried to distill them into 6 things. You could say, well, there are other principles as well, and of course there are. There are an infinite number of principles that you can apply, but I think that most of the things that we think about fit somehow within these 6 or are related to these 6 principles.
I think one of the challenges has been that often this discussion is made out to be very technical and very difficult for ordinary people to engage with. And of course, some of the data analysis that the Institute has done is quite technical, but that doesn't mean the entire conversation needs to be technical. It is actually possible for people to engage with the basic principles of fairness or fair distribution. It's also possible for people to understand data when it's properly visualized and shared with them. And if we can take those two things together, led by thought leaders, media, civil society organizations that have an interest in these areas, then I think we can generate a more useful and productive national conversation, and then that conversation can be localized to particular conversations around the CRA formula, around the education sector, around what a particular county is doing.
And so beyond this, I think we need to also use this to target the policymakers. At the county level, at the national level, and they'll be able to also give you feedback and see how we can take this process forward.
I do hope we will really scale up these conversations beyond this group so that we influence the next planning and budgeting processes going forward.
But we need to think about. We're a few people in this room, but we also represent quite a diverse set of institutions. And we need to think about how we build a larger network that is seen and heard to be demanding for data that we can actually use to inform policy and so forth, so that we can also, that also helps us then to empower these champions within government that we're talking about, to push for that, to make sure that the budgets are allocated for whatever is needed to generate new data, et cetera, so that the data is timely. And we can see this happening already in certain places. If you look at the discourse in Elgeyo-Marakwet County, for example, around the reform of their Equitable Development Act, you can see a wider constituency getting involved, using data, using principles to have a conversation with both county assembly members and with the county executive. And so I think that that kind of conversation can be multiplied in many different spaces and bring in lots of different kinds of actors so that we begin to have both a deeper understanding of these issues, more legitimacy, and ultimately more fairness and less inequality.
So it's a new way of reporting, which I think is a challenge for most newsrooms, but I'm glad to say a few of them are coming to the realization. And I think one of the things is, I always say, have journalists in the room when you're having these conversations. It's not done enough. We expect certain miraculous changes. They will not happen. We've been stuck in a certain modus of way of operating. We need to shift. How do we change that? How do we change attitudes? It's by showing things that work, that they will get more response, they'll get more reaction, they'll get actually be able to communicate much more and get responses from their audiences if they start using this kind of information instead of he said, she said.
To build and sustain a community is a really tough job. And Jason and I were just discussing, we were saying, we brought people to this first meeting, they're very excited, but you don't want to call them for another meeting that talks about the next meeting. How do we kind of create the resources and the excitement around taking this data to their communities? So if you, across the room, we have civil society organizations, we have media people, we have academia, and people like Jason. So the question really is, how do we maintain that mutual shared interest around the various aspects of data?